As week 3 ends in the Low Rim League, it is once again time to update the power rankings. In this week, the top 3 teams have some statistics that make them really stand out. Let's get right into it. Coming in at number 11 in this week's power rankings is Team Bryce. They're 0-2 this past week. They lost to Team Nick 50 to 34. And let's look at their stats. They're the worst shooting team in the league in terms of percentage. They're minus 8.5 in net steals per game and minus 7.5 in net rebounding per game. They just don't get as many possessions as their opponents, and that's really showing on the scoreboard. At Team 10 is Team Alec. This week, they lost Tony, and he was replaced by David. They lost to Team Lath 50 to 25, and they finished this week 1-2. Key statistics: they shot very poorly versus Lath's team, and they're overall the second worst shooting team in the league in terms of shooting percentage, minus 15 in net rebounding per game. They allow their opponents to shoot 50% from the field, which is way above league average. But on the bright side, they've only allowed 5 steals in 3 games played, which is near the best in the league. Spot number 9, Team Zach. They're jumping from team number 11 to team number 9 this week after a win over Reed 52 to 49. They're 1-2, and they're a slightly above average shooting team. They actually have the second best 3-point shooting percentage in the league, but they're tied for the worst in opponent 3-point shooting percentage, and they're also the second worst team in terms of net steals per game. Team number 8 this week is Team Reed. They're falling over the last 2 weeks. They lost to Zach 52 to 49. It was a close game, but overall they're 1-2. They're just about an average shooting team, and they actually are top 3 in assists per game and net assists per game. And they allow their opponents to shoot way above league average from 2. They allow 57%, while league average is 43%. Team number 7 in this week is Team Justin. They're 1-2 after their loss to Luke 51 to 49. They're a below average shooting team from all over the court. Their opponents shoot better than average from 2, second best team in terms of net steals per game, but they're the worst team in terms of assists per game. This week's team number 6 is Team James. They're actually moving up due to poor play of other teams, and they only had a bye, but we can still look at their stats. Second best team in terms of blocks per game, best shooting 3-point team in terms of percentage, and they're the second best team in opponent's shooting percentage, so they're a pretty good defensive team. Spot number 5 this week is Team Luke. They're jumping up from, I believe, 9 to 5 after a win over Team Justin. They're number 1 in steals per game, but they're last in opponents' rebounding per game. Overall, they're an average shooting team, and they allow opponents to shoot an average percentage. Now, team number 4 this week is Team Mike. They take a 1-spot drop after a loss to Team Donny 51 to 31. They're last in blocks per game, overall an average shooting team, and allow opponents to shoot just about league average. Now, here's where it gets good. Team number 3 is Team Lath. They're jumping from spot 4 to 3, and many can make the argument they should be moving up higher, but the top 2 teams won this week, and they'll stay put. Lath's team won over Team Alec 50 to 25, the most lopsided game in league history, and they are number 1 in shooting percentage, number 1 in assists per game, number 1 in opponents' points per game, number 1 in opponents' rebounding per game, number 1 in net points, and number 1 in net rebounds. Some could make the case that this should be the number 1 team. Well, I'm putting them at 3 for right now. But this could all change tonight. At 6:15, they play the number 1 team in what could be a game of the year. But let's move on to team number 2, Team Donny. No change from last week. They're 2-1 with their win over Team Mike, 51 to 31, and they're tied for number 3 in blocks per game, number 2 in steals per game, number 2 in opponent's points per game, number 1 in opponent 3-point percentage, number 2 in net points per game. But here's the catch. They're second to last in opponent rebounds per game. That may be partly due to the fact that they played the number 1 team in week 1, and that's skewing the data a little bit. But anyways, moving on. The number 1 team in the league, yet again, is Team Nick. They're the only undefeated team left. They beat Team Bryce 50-34, and they're number 1 in points per game, number 1 in rebounds per game, number 2 in assists per game, tied for number 2 in steals per game. Nick Hamilton had 9 steals last game. That is a league record, and he was 1 off a triple-double. They're number 3 in net points per game, number 1 in opponent shooting percentage, number 2 in net rebounding, and number 2 in net assists. Overall, this is just a pretty dominant team, but they got a tough matchup tonight against Team Lathe, and that's going to be a fun one to watch.